Progressive policies in America have always failed because people refuse to deal with the reality of racism in America. And so this is a historical pattern that rears its ugly head every single time I think white Americans get tired of the oppressive policies of American society. And so this is a part of a series where I'm going back into three historical moments in which we talk about Reconstruction, the New Deal, and the Great Society programs. There will be another overture, I think, into the 1600s, but we'll get to that later. But when it comes to Reconstruction, I am starting off with the idea of suffrage because you had a coalition built up from a Quaker like Susan B. Anthony and a woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were actually abolitionists during this time period, and they advocated for the abolition of slavery. But when Congress, which is what they do, they implement compromises. Those two prominent women's rights suffragettes immediately went to advocate to the Democrats of that time, who were the party of the KKK, right, the party of slavery, in order to advocate for white women's suffrage above, we will say, black men and black women, instead of staying in coalition with them, right? Now, in this particular instance, I'm going to highlight the ways in which they fell back into some old historical patterns and how they tried to use racism to elevate themselves above black men and black women for their own benefit. And this is particularly after the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed. Now, when it comes to the 14th Amendment, it's the first time that the word male was ever put in the Constitution. The 15th Amendment also gave black men, former slaves, the right to vote. And these two prominent women's rights suffragettes, right, believed that it would just bring in more men to vote against the idea of suffrage. So immediately, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton decided that they would work with a racist Democrat in order to fund their newspaper to spread their message that if there was anyone that was worthy of the vote, it was the white woman. And they destroyed this multiracial progressive coalition called the American Equal Rights Association. So I'm going to read some of the quotes that they came up with after. So, arguing on behalf of female suffrage, Stanton posits that women voters of wealth, education, and refinement are needed to offset the effect of former slaves and immigrants whose pauperism, ignorance, and degradation might severely affect the American political system. And so I think that's a pretty important thing to highlight, that they were in coalition with these same people that they are criticizing, right? But if they did not have the position of prominence, and if they were not put first, they would decide that it would be time to institute those old, I'd say, racial and class lines, regardless of what it did to their own prospects for, I would say, progressive changes in American society. And I'm going to continue, right? She also posits another question. She declares it to be a serious question whether we had better stand aside and see Sambo walk into the kingdom of civil rights first. Again, this idea that if one group gets a massive benefit, then that means that you don't get anything at all, right? And I know I am focusing on women's rights suffrages, right? But this is very, very important to highlight the ways in which these women would be considered the progressives of their time. But because they were not put in, I guess, the first position, they decided to blow up the entire coalition, which they had with individuals like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, right? They decided to blow up a coalition with these people, some of which they had known for years, because they felt as though they didn't have to consider the role that race had in the United States of America. They didn't also have to consider their own racist beliefs. And so this goes into some of the problems that I have with like people like Ro Khanna or Ilhan Omar, or just the multitude of people that are supporting this idea of building a coalition with individuals like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tucker Carlson, and Ann Coulter. These people expressly dabble in racial politics in ways that seeks to demean black people and to question, why do we have to deal with black people's issues in the United States of America? And this is one example of why I think it's very, very naive to immediately say that just because they say one thing that you agree with, or they disagree with one country that you hate, to immediately say all is forgiven, and I believe that these people will be on our side because Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tucker Carlson, and Ann Coulter are the exact same kinds of people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. There are certain things that they will not abide by, but they will always try to put their whiteness above anything that they're ever working for. And their, I would say, resume speaks for itself. So I'm going to continue to find more quotes when it comes to this idea of women's suffrages, and how they felt about the 14th and 15th Amendments, and how that allowed them to destroy their progressive coalition that was working for universal suffrage, which ran into a roadblock because of the compromises Congress always makes. The next thing will go into the ways in which it has to do with voting, right? And how poor white people justified taking away the right to vote from black men because they felt as though it would elevate their whiteness above anything else. And it's a pattern that we have to acknowledge. It's a pattern that we have to share, because if we don't have people acknowledge what happens, we're going to fall into the same exact traps every single time. So yeah.